And here we have Aleksandar Indjic versus the world champion Magnus Carlsen at the FIDE World Rapid Blitz in Warsaw, Poland, right at the end of 2021. Magnus making sure all those pieces look good and feeling good. You looking good, Lewis? Feeling good, Billy Ray. Let's push our pawns and play a QGD. What do you say? Here we go. No more trading places for you. Instead, we have just the chess on the board with a traditional Queen's Gambit decline for those who don't speak QGD with the bishop f4 development instead of bishop to g5. This is very traditional stuff as c5. Okay, this is a Tarrasch approach to the otherwise more traditional orthodox type of structure. You can play the move pawn to c6, for example, instead of c5. The risk of this approach, of course, is that black is going to be strapped likely with an isolated queen pawn. IQP, again, for those who speak French. White plays a3 first, which makes sense, but likely here in the very near future, Indjic will choose to capture on d5. Magnus will likely just take back with the pawn rather than the knight, and that's because you want pieces on the board when you're the one with the IQP, because the isolated queen pawn is a weakness positionally. It is a pawn that will slowly be targeted, and the minor pieces are often critical for the squares around the pawn that you want to be active, you want to be controlling those squares, and so e takes d5 opens up the bishop on c8 for Carlsen, and maybe even prepares the move pawn to d4. D4 is a strike you can look for early and often when you have an IQP, because the exchange of this pawn is quite simply the elimination of your biggest weakness. The risk of D4, if it doesn't work tactically, is that sometimes you might lose the pawn and or suffer some other consequences. But in this particular position, D4 seems like a very, very typical thing to do, especially because white hasn't castled yet, and that was the reason it caught my eye and why I was suggesting it just a moment ago before Indjic played bishop e2, because d4 is typically even stronger when opening the board favors you, right? In this particular position, if d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4 is played, the e-file opens up for Carlsen, for the rook on e8, having already castled. He's doing well here. The move d4 could have been met by knight to a4 by Indjic. That is just a pure kind of random suggestion here, not necessarily something the computer would say is much better. But I think knight a4 is a response you might have seen in a slower time control, adding a little bit of complexity. Carlsen is open and ready for business in the endgame. This exchange is going to bring the dark square bishop to d4, which hits the knight on c3, and with X-ray vision goggles, also hits the pawn on b2. This is important because this already has the feeling of a Magnus, vintage Magnus type of game, right? This is a position where white's edge is completely gone. Black has equalized. Does Carlsen have anything super special? No. But he has a small lead in development, right? Everything else is equal except black has already castled. And his minor pieces pound for pound, if you were to compare each one of them, black probably wins the battle by a nano point in each particular case. Even the bishop on c8, you could argue, has a better future potentially than the bishop on e2, depending on what happens with this queenside structure. Black, of course, could even be considering things like bishop takes c3 here, and after b takes c3, you have an isolated c-pawn. The loss of the bishop pair may not really improve Carlsen's long-term winning chances, so he might not do that. But Indjic proves to us that he might have been a little worried about that, right? So he plays knight to b5, which hits the bishop on d4. It also, of course, threatens things like knight to c7, but it gives up the b2 pawn. And that tells you what a small advantage can do to your opponent. Just a little bit of pressure. The fact that you were castled, the fact that you were maybe even bluffing at taking on c3 to isolate that c-pawn. Maybe Carlsen would have done it, but the point is, it was already, no matter, it doesn't matter because the threat of it is more relevant than whether it was ever executed. In this case, he forced white to do something risky, and he's lost the b2 pawn. Black has a couple of different things he can do here. Obviously, the bishop on b2 is running out of squares, but white also has some things to worry about. For example, knight to d5 is a natural move that you would consider here if you're black, both defending c7 and attacking the bishop on f4. The fact that white isn't developed, again, you have to think about tactics with the rook coming to e8 and the bishop on e2 being pinned. So Carlsen's going to pause for a moment and take a big think because he's won a pawn, he's earned it, if you will. He can think about this before he commits to what exactly he wants to do. If I had to guess, the best move has to be knight to d5, though. The more I look at it, the more I think that I was maybe suffering from a little bit of Magnus biased itis in the sense that I assume this is going to be good for black, and I think it is, but I think he does actually have to play knight d5 the more I look at it, because you have to attack this bishop in order to not just gain a tempo, but open up the c3 square as an option. The knight on d5 will attack the bishop and maybe threaten things like bishop to c3 check, where after knight takes c3, knight takes c3, black is forking the rook on b1 and the bishop on e2, so Carlsen would not be going down the bishop pair, for example. In fact, the more I say it, good thing for me, I actually don't have the analysis up. Sometimes I often do have the engine running during this just to keep me on track, but I'm here to give you the education and the funk and the fun. You know how we do here. But I'm actually just solving this in real time. So knight to d5, bishop to c3 with no analysis in front of me. This looked necessary. Again, if the king moves, there are two things black would consider. My guess would be bishop to f5, attacking the rook on b1. The other, of course, move is you can move the rook to safety. But likely, if the king moves, bishop to f5, gaining a tempo first makes a lot of sense, because now your rook has more options. It can even go to c8 from f8 next. It can go to d8. And again, this is a critical position. You can tell by the time the players are taking, right? The world champion doesn't think unless he really needs to, and he did. And Indjic definitely took his time to make sure that he calculated this exchange correctly. And in the end, we get a very, very forcing series of moves here where we're likely just seeing the game simplify out into an endgame where black is up a pawn. Rook to d3, knight to c2 check, and then bishop f5. Interesting. Okay, bishop to f5 was played. Black probably also could have taken f8 first and on king takes c2, then played bishop f5. Having briefly looked at the game beforehand, I remember now that actually was something that I think black should have done. Again, Carlsen doesn't make too many mistakes when converting his advantages, but taking on f8 first and then playing bishop f5 after black took the knight on c2 is a little more accurate. Either way, in this particular move order, if white takes c2, you're going to see rook to c8. Carlsen does it. Winning back the bishop on c5 means you are just up a clean pawn in a rook ending. Not all rook endings are drawn when Magnus Carlsen is playing them, especially when he's up a pawn. So this is not fun, right? If you're Indjic, you kind of did that quick shuffle, you shoved your piece over. That's often something top chess players do when they're kind of like, all right, I'm gathering myself, right? I'm gathering myself for the next stage, because every stage of the game comes with a little bit of a mindset and an emotional sort of perspective that you can carry based on your goals of that particular time. And when you know that, all right, I'm now in an endgame where I'm going to be hoping to draw. I only have one goal here, which is to hold, not to win. That's a hard thing to do against Magnus when he's up a pawn. He can fiddle his pieces. He can slowly march forward on the king side. Objectively, with best play, I think that white actually has very good drawing chances in this type of endgame. But in blitz, objectively with best play is not necessarily the phrase we're uttering. Eventually, time pressure will ensue for everyone, right? Time is the enemy of us all. Isn't that relevant right now when it comes to talking about commentary on blitz games? Rook to b4, a very strong move. Rook a5. The reason rook takes a4 didn't work is because white would have had rook to b5, winning either the b7 or a5 pawn back. But now we see Carlsen has comfortably established where he wants his bind on the queen side. Everything's protecting each other. He can slowly advance the king side. After this check, king f4, you're already getting very nervous here. Yeah. Again, objectively, I don't know yet whether white has lost this game or not, but this is already a very hard position to hold. Black has clearly made progress with the white king having to retreat all the way back to the first rank. And watch what Magnus is going to do with the pawns on the king side here, because this should be a good lesson for everyone who looks at symmetrical structures and says, oh, 3 pawns versus 3 pawns, there's nothing to it. There's always something to it, okay? The fact that you can eventually play the move g4, which will likely be what Magnus does before f4, indeed he does, and now you see the key. If a takes g4, f takes g4, then black threatens a passed h-pawn, and the passed h-pawn would be way farther advanced than white's passed f-pawn. So you see the space advantage combined with the activity of your other pieces turns something that was symmetrical into something that is a huge advantage. Look at this. G3, now you're threatening rook f2 check. You're even threatening rook to b1 check and perhaps sliding around to g1. In fact, now that I say that, I believe that is the idea that Magnus Carlsen does here. Indeed, that's what he does. He wins g2, and now when the rook slides over, you have 2 passed pawns on g3 and f5. Whether you win the h-pawn or not, the fact is, as soon as the black king moves and we start advancing the f-pawn, it's over, right? Magnus will be choosing here between taking h5. I would bet that even f4 and f3 there was probably winning, but king takes h5 and king back is going to be enough to take this home. Indjic agrees, shakes hands, gives that, you see that subtle head nod. I wonder, can we instant replay that subtle head nod and eyebrows look? I bet our video production and editing team can do that. We'll back up in a minute and see that. But here we're seeing some vintage Magnus Carlsen pointing of the middle finger as he suggests which pieces should have moved better in this game. No, I'm kidding, but I don't think Magnus was purposely using either of the fingers, but he was just giving suggestions on where and when he thought Indjic could have improved. But that was instructive. And again, sometimes when you see games won that maybe shouldn't have been won, they are the most instructive of all games because it shows you that chess is hard. Chess is a game that is won by the better player. If the position is objectively equal, that just means whoever plays better from here on out wins. And Magnus Carlsen, as the world champion, often plays better chess than everyone else on the planet. What an instructive rook ending conversion there. And again, hope you're enjoying all of these videos. Click on the next one from either me or Danya that you see before your very eyes. Give us a comment down low. We know you're loving it, and we'll see you around on Chess.com.